All right. The reason why we're looking at a presentation which says Vienna, September 2012, is because I brought this presentation on a USB stick, because I'm now a resident in Vienna at the Museumskwartier, and I was there 1 week when my laptop died, just like that. And so I'm here with a borrowed laptop from somebody in Vienna, and I had no way of, no way and no appetite to work with this really old borrowed computer and fix you something completely new. But anyway, this will do just fine, because it is a presentation that is meant to be about my book. So. But before I actually start this presentation, and I hope that you don't have to run back and forth all the time, I would just like to tell you a little bit about how I got into what I do. At the end of the 80s, I was interested in a few different things, and two very particular ones. One was the connection between mind and body, and the second one was something which kind of puzzled me, which actually what I'm telling you now is also in the book. So it's how I got to writing about net art and how I got into this in the first place, because a lot of people ask me, how on earth do you start investigating art in the internet? So the second thing next to the connection mind-body was why is art so boring? I went to a lot of openings in the 80s, a lot of openings at art schools, in galleries and museums, and the art was usually, the kind of standard art that most people think of when they think of art is paintings, sculptures, installations, maybe a photograph, maybe a video, and that's it. And I thought, with how we live, the society as it is, with all the media that surround us, why is art so confined to an object or to a space? Why is it not somewhere more, in the world? Why is it not dispersed more? And so then in 91 I was at Ars Futura. I was in Spain as a tourist and just happened to come to this really interesting festival, and Derek de Kerkhofer was a speaker there. He was the director of the Marshall McLuhan Institute, and he started to talk about Marshall McLuhan's theory of media as extensions of the nervous system. And I had never heard of McLuhan before, and this notion of media as extensions of the nervous system, it brought together these two things that I was thinking about, the mind-body connection, and what about art that deals with the way we really are in the world, namely as medial persons, as medial identities. So I found that fascinating, but I didn't really do anything with it until I actually encountered artists that worked with this. When I started to do a series of interviews in 1993 about artists working with the body, there were several events organized by V2, who was then in Den Bosch, which is now the Media Lab of Europe, placed in Rotterdam, but at that time it was in a smaller city in the Netherlands. And all the big names, or many of the big names that you know from media art history were there. Like there was Gerfried Stocker, who is now director of Ars Electronica. There was Karl Dudecek and Ponton Media Lab, who did a fantastic project in 1992, Documenta, where they did sort of media orgy artwork, Van Gogh TV, where they put all kinds of media together and used a very coarse, basic form of the internet for the first time in the work, and connected it to TV networks all over Europe, actually. So these guys was there. Robert Adrian was there, and he's actually one of my biggest influences, because meeting somebody who actually started the very first online artist mailing list in 1981 was like mind-blowing to me. I didn't even know there were mailing lists in 1981, but so apparently there was, and I learned a great deal from meeting people like that, and I was just fascinated. It was just pure, simple fascination at that moment in time that led me to decide from now on I will focus on art made with and around the internet. And that's what I did. And so by pure chance, really, when the net started to explode in the mid-90s, and a lot of attention arose around it, I was there and I was publishing interviews with artists working with the internet, and it just all went crazy from there. And so it was a very, how do you say, tumultuous situation for me. So from going from very slow investigation and research and talking to artists from 1993 to 1996, suddenly after I published interviews on the mailing list Nettime in 1997, and my very first text, which I wrote also in early 1997, was immediately published in 3 different magazines, and so the amount of attention was just crazy, and it sort of how do you say, illustrates the hype that was going on, the frenzy around the internet and the curiosity around it. And when you're in the middle of something like that, it is very hard to keep your head cool and to keep control of the situation. In fact, it's impossible. So what happened is that so many things happened at the same time, and all I tried to do was push the work of artists who were working with the net that I knew, because there was a lot of talk about art made with the internet. That's actually why I started to publish my work in writing, because before that I was a radio journalist. What happened in 1997 was that some texts appeared on Nettime about net art, and I thought these texts failed to really clarify that there was already quite some interesting stuff done with the internet. And these were speculative texts like, oh, what if Jeff Koons were to use the internet? What if famous artists, what if really good art would be made with the internet? And I thought, people are already doing things, let's write that down. And so, there came this really strange, I would almost say there was a really quite competitive tension around it from the beginning on. And so because the group of artists that I put forward got so much attention, and because many of them were friends and they started to also meet at different festivals and so on, artists that were not part of that group of group of friends started to feel jealous, started to feel buitengesloten, closed out, how do you say? Excluded, that's the word, yes. So there was all this, very soon there was talk about an inner circle of net.art. There was all kinds of gossip going around. And also, because everything happened so fast, and this is one thing that I also try to explore a little bit in my book, but I think needs to be explored more, is one of the reasons I think net art was never really explored well, or why it actually started to get misrepresented quite early on, is that it developed in a field where everybody could speak on the same level. So artists, critics, people who know nothing about art, people who don't care about art, people who just want to promote their own stuff, really heavy academics, activists, all of them on one mailing list talking about net art, about the artists. And all of them, some with agendas, some just trying to, I don't know, disturb the situation. So it was a very strange atmosphere at the time. And anyway, what happened was that the variety that was happening in art practices at the time, and that is still happening in art practices at the time, was never really discussed well. What happened was, through all that noise, that only some very strong cliches about net art survived in the mainstream of net art discourse. And this, I think, is really a problem. And I've tried to undermine this, and I've tried to tackle it in my book. And so I guess that's where I start from this presentation, and hopefully it will make sense. Anyway, I'll just start. Now I'm here with a laptop that I don't really know well, but I guess it's just this, yes. So I think that my introduction of how I got to net art and what the artists that I saw in 1993 already clarifies a little bit, is that there are many ways to talk about art in the internet. And what I've come to realize after working with this for now nearly 20 years, and is that there is no fixed way to talk about net art. There's no way to say this is art that you can see on the internet. This is art that is made for a browser. There's no way like that. There's no simple way in like that. And there's a very simple reason for that, because this machine that you see here in front of you and the screen that you see here, the screen is a very simple thing, but this machine is not. This machine has many different little tools inside, as it were. This is a tool collected with a collection of other tools. It's connected to the internet, and the internet itself is a tool. And there's many different people here in the audience, and I'm pretty sure that although a lot of you share certain ways in which you use this stuff, many of you do things that other people don't. So there's different ways for artists to use this. A painter will use it in a different way than a sculptor, will look at the software in a different way as a sculptor. A performance artist will use it in a completely different way altogether. Again, an installation artist will do the same thing. Then there's poets who will suddenly expand their work also in different ways, just because of the new context, because of the new tools, etc., etc. So it's really tools, and then I'm talking about all the tools that are in here and that the network makes up together, meeting all kinds of different art practices. And if you think of art practices, really think of the entire scope. So think about anything you can imagine of contemporary art. So, yes, this is really talking about what you then can encounter. This is a variety of things that you meet. I don't want to talk about this actually right now. So this is the cliche of net art, that it's pictures that you watch online. You know, some of them are, this is the Matrix that came up, and the ASCII art stuff from Vukčović, whose work is also hanging here. And Olja Janina's work, Agatha appears, the woman here. So there's this cliche that net art is something that you view through a browser. And I really think this is something to move away from. Another cliche that is very strong about net art is that it is a subversive practice, that it is really important that net artists are anti-institutional and that they push a sort of criticality about the art system forward, and that they are kind of activists or rebels on the internet. And I think that that puts a lot of pressure on these artists, and that's also what made the whole net.art scene collapse actually at the end of the 90s, because at the end of the 90s the build-up of pressure on mailing list like NetTime, on these net.art artists, was so strong about how they were ineffective, how they could actually not subvert the art system, how they were selling out, because some of them did exhibitions in Documenta and so forth. So this pressure, it really takes away a broader perspective on what art and the internet actually, what happens when these two meet. And this is what I'm trying to illustrate with this picture here, that when we talk about the transition that we experience now with art, it's just a way of art and culture as a whole moving from an industrial era into an information era. So we're moving to a completely different environment in which this art is made and in which this art is received. And one important difference, of course, is this one illustrated by these two pictures. Formerly, we had to go to the big institutions or to a gallery to see art, most of all, and now there's no place like home. This is the IP address from your own home computer. Huh? You can, there's the audience and the artist both have connection to, well, the art world, as it were, from your home computer. It's a different situation, and I think that both artists and art institutions need to become more aware of this and need to take this much more seriously. So I have to slow down for a moment. Take my breath. What this relates to, I don't know if you guys know who Artie Vierkant is. Has any of you heard of the post-internet art scene? So one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about how what we have when we talk about art and the internet is not an art that is subversive, but a tool that is subversive. So it's, or a multiple of tools that altogether changes how art is made and changes the possibilities, changes the field. I wanted to talk about that because that was clear very early on. And these things were discussed in the 80s, in the 90s. But somehow, because the discussions around it were not dealt with in the mainstream art field or in the academic art field in a really in-depth way, this was not passed on to newer generations. So what came out is that in 2005, 2006, new generations of artists, especially in the United States, started to build on cliché ideas of, cliché notions of what net art is. So they had heard that net art was all about subverting the internet or about subverting the art institution. That was what they had heard. And they said, well, it's much more than that. And so what happened is that Artie Vierkant, he's one of these younger artists, he makes artworks like this. This is post-internet art. It's really quite interesting because it's a sort of conceptual expansion of the net art field. There was already a conceptual expansion of that outside the internet. But what happens here is that a lot of artists, younger artists now, use tools that are used a lot for web design into making stuff that is offline. So making paintings, making pictures, making installations that are really about copying, about how do you say, photoshopping, stuff like that. And so this Artie Vierkant wrote a sort of manifesto-ish kind of thing. It's called the object image post-internet, if I'm not mistaken. And there he names these things as the things that should be discussed but have not been discussed yet. Now, the lack of fixity of the art object. Of course, in a media environment, has been a problem from the beginning on. And the original copy, the reception of social presence, democratization of tools, community practice, all these things are things that need to be discussed, but as I said above it, these are postponed debates. Somehow it takes a long time, by now 20 to 30 years, if you look back even from when Robert Adrian started to discuss these things, in 1981, these things are still not really being taken seriously within the art world and are not really taught well or discussed well in art schools. And the consequences of dealing with new media beyond the visuals are really hardly an issue in art schools. And so that is something that we really need to discuss. And this new generation puts it back on the table, and that's what I like about them. So, one thing that always happens to me, actually you did it too, is that people say, what do you think are the top 5 or the best 10 artworks that should be saved for posterity from net art? And then I say, well, so I don't really like to do that because I think it's more important that people can see these things for themselves. I think it is absolutely useless if I give a museum 10 artworks on a list and they have no clue why I chose those works. If they do not understand that there's actually a very specific poetic way of using programming languages in this work, or that there is a reference to a very specific social context on the internet in this work, or whether it's about very aesthetic aspects of web design that are being reused in physical sculpture. When people don't understand these things, it's kind of useless to feed them the names of artists, because most of the time they will just dismiss your list as completely uninteresting because they don't understand it. I find it really quite shocking when I go to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Amsterdam and I talk to the main curator, and by just mentioning the word net art, he will go, oh, I want nothing to do with that, that's horrible. And I think, oh my God, this reminds me of when I was 17 or even younger, going with my grandparents to a modern art museum and seeing minimal art for the first time, a stripe on a canvas saying, my God, is that art? Why is that in this museum? So unfortunately, it is still very fashionable around really highly educated art professionals to dismiss new media art as completely uninteresting while being also totally uninformed and knowing not a damn thing about it. And that is that I find shocking. I mean, I really don't mind discussing artworks with you, but please, do it from a bit of an informed level, or do it with a bit of dignity. Because to give you also an illustration of an example I use in my book, if there is one person whose opinions I really cannot stand, it's Nicolas Bourriaud, who is often quoted and even used as whose work, Relational Aesthetics, is often used in the context of new media art. And I'll tell you why. I was at a presentation 2 years ago, by a lecture series organized by the University of Amsterdam and Stedelijk Museum. And one evening was about interactivity. 2 speakers, Claire Bishop and Nicolas Bourriaud. And the whole evening about interactivity, we sit there, we listen. No media artworks being discussed the entire evening, not one. And at some point there's questions, so a friend of mine gets up to the microphone, and she's a very gentle person, and she says, I'm a bit surprised that there was no mention of media art in this context of interactivity. Why? How do you feel about media art? And so there was the panel, Claire Bishop, Nicolas Bourriaud, and the moderator. The moderator had a microphone. Nicolas Bourriaud grabbed the microphone like that and said, "Have you ever seen good media art? Neither have I. That's why we don't talk about it." So that is the attitude that we have to deal with, and I find that shocking, to be honest. So that's why I say knowledge before judgment, learning to see and acknowledge the form always, that you have to understand that this work by Atao Tanaka, Global String, is not just a metal wire that is connected to a wall in the floor. That this is actually the one end of a musical instrument, of which the internet or the data transfer between the 2 ends of the string is part of the string. And that there's software that makes it sound on both ends. But so to understand how this works, and that you can collaborate, but that you can also see it as a sculpture, these are important things to realize. And then this, of course, for I suppose for traditional art curators, this is still quite simple to see, because you can still see it as a sculpture. But for software art or other artworks, like for instance Jodi's work, it's a bit more tough. Anyway, the Curator Engineer, yes. There's a group of artists in Berlin that I got this name from. I borrowed the Curator Engineer from. They wrote a manifesto group called the Critical Engineering Manifesto, and these are the first 5 lines in that manifesto. And what they really call for is they are artists, so they are calling upon other artists to be critical about new media. And one of the things that they mention is that artists should look beyond the awe of implementation. And I really like this term, look beyond the awe of implementation. Because one problem that we have to deal with is that, especially in technical schools, they just teach people to learn the newest software, to work with the newest software, without questioning what this software does, who makes it, why it's made the way it's made, etc. And it's just, we got the newest iPhone, okay, now, that's the awe of implementation. To stand in line for the Mac store to get the newest machine, or the newest software. Just get it without even knowing why, because it's the newest thing. So we have to move beyond that, especially in the art world. And one of the reasons why we have to do that is because we have to think of the future. And when you buy, especially software-based art, you have to consider conservation, preservation, as something that needs to be done even before you buy something, before you get engaged with the work. Because you have to think of all kinds of things like what kind of contract am I going to make, and how am I going to preserve this? Am I going to allow copies? Am I going to allow the audience to stay involved? Am I going to allow the audience to touch it at all? Am I going to leave the work online? Am I going to put it in an archive? Am I going to document it alone, or am I going to keep it alive? There's all these things that I discuss in the 4th chapter of my book, actually, which is about archiving, that art institutions do not deal with thoroughly. They still think from a traditional background, and in a traditional background you put something in an archive and you just make sure it doesn't disappear. And if you can do that. You can still do that with software art or code art or anything digital born, but then you have to consider that the best way to preserve it is not by putting it into a vault, but actually to leave it out of the vault and have an audience involved. To illustrate this, I quote somebody called Jon Ippolito, who wrote a wonderful essay about this, in which he explains how he is always surprised about how some art institutions spend millions and millions of dollars to try and save digital collections and fail. They just fail. Whereas gamers, who want to save their favorite game from the 80s, that's running on machines that are obsolete, they manage to preserve this work on their own, doing that in their underwear in their mother's basement for nothing, all together. So there's something to be said for opening up the archive in a certain way. If you talk about taking art institutions into the future, you have to consider, how am I going to create my media side? What am I going to do with that? How I'm going to build that archive? And there's a lot of issues to be dealt with at that moment in time, because then you're really building a new architectural addition to your physical institution that has just as many problems and issues as your physical building does. So you need to think about the walls, the guards, the audience, who you let in where, and, well, you can imagine. Trying to think how I can jump to the philosophy of science from this. A theorist that I greatly admire is Wilhelm Flusser, and he wrote somewhere that what he really thinks we need to get forward in the world is to have people think, to have great minds think about philosophy in a different way, namely in a more scientific way, that we need a philosophy of science. Because what has happened is that the science field, especially the hard science, have moved away separately from the soft sciences, as you will. And I find it interesting to see that there's now new interest in materialism. Well, they even call it new materialism. And it's something that also Donna Haraway is part of. So there's a cyber-feminist side to it. When you were mentioning in your introduction how I include also software art in net art because of the way that it develops is strongly connected with networks. Biotechnology is the same thing. So I also include biotech there. There's very interesting overlaps between different scientific fields now because of digital technologies being implemented in all these fields, be it in very different ways, but there are also overlaps because, well, the possibility to share something once it is a digital entity that changes something, that changes things so radically. Anyway, let's move on. So what I make a plea for is a more sensory understanding, a more deep understanding of what the materiality is of net art, what different forms it can take. And with that, I put a picture of an installation by Joyce Hinterding, which is actually a sound art installation called Arryology. Don't know if any of you know this work, but what it does, it takes radio signals from the air on a very low frequency. So these are radio, you might think that radio is something that is made for the FM or M, and that is made by people, but radio is actually using phenomena that exist already around us. When radio was first used, radio is a network form actually, was first used or made on machines. And in the 19th century, there was a lot of disturbance from natural phenomena that you could still hear on these radios. So, yes, I would really like artists and curators and critics to look more deeply into what digital technologies are and what new media are, and to understand them more like they would look at the history of painting or the history of sculpture or the history of performance, instead of just looking at what happens on the screen. And I close off with this performance, if you will, by Jody, done 2-3 years ago as part of an exhibition they had in their hometown. This is to show the people that URLs, that websites are real, that they are, they belong to the world and they're material things. And they did that quite literally by putting them on banners and doing a demonstration down the streets of different web addresses. Dordrecht, yeah. And I don't know how long I've been talking, but I think I should maybe leave it like this, and I would gladly talk to you about things that came up. If you have questions or if you have remarks, please come, because I'm pretty sure I left some things out in my talk.
Thank you.